Hello everybody and welcome back. In this lecture we're going to have a look at the render settings for Eevee. Eevee is a render engine that comes with Blender. It's a very quick render engine, but it cuts corners. It's not hyper realistic, at least not out of the box. You have to work for it. Whereas Cycles is far more realistic than Eevee is, but it's a lot slower to render out a scene, and it often ends up having a lower quality for the same time of render. Now we're going to use our rendering workspace at the top here. We're going to have a look at how changing some of these settings actually alters the render time. Because when you do a render, at the very top here, we can see the frame that it is. We seem to be on frame 9. I've obviously pressed space at some point and pressed play. The frame you can change at the very bottom back to 1. We're not animating, so it doesn't matter. But when we render it, we get a time. We get a memory usage and we see the peak that it was working at. Now this says 0.58 of a second. If I press it again, 0.57, 0.57, so it's pretty consistent, but it can vary depending on how long and complex a particular render is and what else your computer is doing at the time. So this will not be our base render because I want to zoom in because we're going to be playing with the settings. So let's turn on the render properties. We'll look at this. We've got the render engine set to Eevee, and then we've got a series of settings underneath. We're not going to go through every single one. We'll go through a few of them and see the quality improvement we get and the price we pay for it. Now, I do want to focus a bit more closely on Suzanne the monkey, so I'm going to whiz over. I'll say whiz, that's set quite slow, and I'm going to fill up the screen with her. Now, when I press F12, this is going to be our baseline. It's about 0.42 of a second. We can render it a couple of times to see if we can get a better result. It's always going to be around 0.4 by the looks of it. Let's leave it at 0.38 because that's going to be a tough time to beat. And this is the great thing about Eevee. It is quicker. Let's move over to slot 2. We can use the numbers at the top of the keyboard for that as well. And I'm just going to switch this to Workbench quickly and press F12. Now, we're not going to dive into Workbench or Cycles, but I do want a quick comparison between them all. That doesn't look like it's got any colour in it, but it did complete a lot quicker. Finally, let's go to Cycles. We're already at 30 seconds. You know what? I'm going to cancel that. Oh, I think it's just done, actually. Saying that. Yes, it has just done. But that's so much longer for a much lower quality image. But if we have a look at the difference between slot 1 and slot 2 for a moment, you'll notice some things like areas are more realistically shadowed. There's a proper shadow along where Suzanne is sat, and it seems not quite the case with Eevee. There's far more detail in reflections and things like that. So that what you're getting for free with Cycles comes with a cost. With Eevee, you have to add this stuff in. So let's go and have a look at that stuff that we are adding in. Let's go to slot 2, close that down for the moment, and switch back over to Eevee. The first one here is Ambient Occlusion. I'm going to zoom in on my model for the moment because everything that I'm changing right here will affect both the render and what we can see in the viewport. Oh, I've actually shut down sampling by mistake. With sampling, the higher the number, the higher the quality. And you'll notice here there's a difference between the render and the viewport. If you're struggling with Eevee, then you can always turn the viewport settings down to something like 1. Look at this. The shadows and things like that are much rougher now, but the viewport response time would be far, far quicker. I'm not sure if I set this at 512, will the viewport get sluggish? No. Can I go higher than that? 2048? No, I'm not able to make it sluggish at the moment on my computer. But once we start turning on some of these other options, that might not be the case anymore. I'm going to leave this as 16. Usually the default settings are fine for using that. And it's got a form of denoising turned on automatically, so we'll leave that on. Ambient Occlusion. Let's zoom back into the areas that will really show this off. If we turn that on, we can see straight away all the cracks and crevices actually have a darkening to them. It's faking where surfaces come into contact with each other or where they are close together. If I zoom out slightly, it also affects the edges here on the pyramid. If I turn that off and turn it back on again, it looks far better. If I use the drop down here, we can see we've got some controls for these, and we can play with them. And let's say we turn the distance up, and we get a much better shadow under our model than we did before. But that will come with a cost. Let's go ahead and hit F12 and see what that cost was. So we've gone from 0.38. Now, I think that's probably a bit too strong on the ambient occlusion front, but artistic decisions aside, our setting change has made a difference to the render time. I'm going to go back to ambient occlusion and set the distance to its default value by right-clicking and resetting to default value, and just rendering that out again. 0.45 versus 0.38. Now, that has taken a little bit more time. But this sort of time increase will compound itself if you're doing an animation. So that's something to be aware of when you're adding quality settings. Let's close that down for the moment. Oh, let's go to the render setting and set slot 3. The next thing, and probably not going to be easy to see on here, is bloom. If I turn it on, we can't really see an appreciable difference. However, if we disappear from here for the moment and go over to this building, I bet we can see the difference with where the light is hitting here. If I turn bloom off and turn it back on again, you get this lovely effect. It's very warming. You get a glow around any bright light sources, and you can use these controls here to change that effect. So if you really wanted it to be really intense, you can turn up the intensity. You can change how bright an area has to be before the effect takes hold. And of course, we can reset those to their default value as well. Now, over here, I couldn't see any difference when I turned bloom on and off. However, if we go ahead and render into slot 3, took 0.51 384551. So even though there's no real difference, actually look around the eye here. This may be very subtle, and it may not even come across with the compression when you're watching this video, but there is a slight glow around the eyeball. So it is making a tiny difference, but it's also increasing the render time as well. Depth of field we're not using, that's a camera property. So we will leave that for the moment, and there's only one thing to change there, and I don't recall I've ever changed it in the past. So we'll leave that as it is for the moment. Subsurface scattering. We don't have any material set up with subsurface scattering in mind. If we do, it will increase our render time because it's more computationally heavy. Let's go ahead and do this. Let's go and set our material that we're using for the stone. Let's change it ever so slightly and go to subsurface. And let's just set that at 50%. And that's changed how this looks. If I now go ahead and render, I'm not sure if I'm in a free slot, so let's go to slot 4 and render that out. We're now at 0.3, and it's changed how this looks. And just like before, if we increase samples, it should increase quality. I'm going to set this to something silly like 32. I can't see any difference between that and 7. Just to really hammer home the point here that a lot of these settings by default are pretty good. Here comes a big one. If we go to the layout view again and have a look at our render properties and go to screen space reflections and put a tick in that box, suddenly our scene comes to life. This whole area here, look, the red is reflecting from the eyeballs and hitting the shiny surface that is this golden statue. And let's go ahead and render that out. We're up at 5.8, so we've got 3.8, 4.5, 5.1, 5.8. Let's go ahead and turn off half race trez, increasing it. Trace precision, well, let's turn that up. And so we're increasing the quality here, but what cost is that? Well, it's more render time. Every time you increase the quality or add something, it's going to have a cost of the time of render. Again, at the moment, what is it, 0.66 of a second? No big deal. However, with an animation, again, that thing will compound. Motion blur, we're not actually animating, so we won't be able to see the effect of that. So we will leave that for the moment. Volumetrics are an interesting one. This is where we can control the settings of volumetrics, but again, we don't have any volumetrics in our scene at the moment, so we can't really see the effect that goes on there. I will demonstrate really quickly how we can do that. If we go to our material properties, in this case, we're not going to use subsurface anymore. We'll turn that off. In fact, we're not going to use any surface properties anymore. So I'm going to click where it says surface with this green dot, and we'll play with this lots and lots later on. And we're going to turn this off. And I can't see the menu options, so I'm going to have to lift my mouse to the top. We're going to remove it. And because this has no material properties anymore, it's gone black. It can't reflect light because it doesn't know how to. However, if we go to volume and add a volume, principled volume, suddenly we've got this ghostly outline that is the pyramid. And you can see it is a bit jerky, and then it resolves itself and gets a bit tighter. Let's go to rendering. Let's go to slot 6 and see what the impact of adding volumetrics is. We're now at 0.88, so it's increased once again. Now with volumetrics, you can turn down the tile size, which will increase the quality, and you can turn up the samples, which again will increase the quality, but they will also impact our render time. I'm going to turn those up quite a lot and go to slot 7. We're almost running out of slots, but you're getting the idea now that each time we add things to our stack, our quality settings, even if we cannot see a difference, it does make a difference. This was 5 seconds a frame. Volumetrics are something that are incredibly heavy on a scene, so only use them if it's actually necessary. There are often different ways, which we'll discuss later on, that you can fake volumetrics and get a brilliant result. Other times it is best to take the hit and use volumetrics instead. Okay, let's have a look down the final things we've got here. Oh, let's go back to the right setting. And in fact, I'm going to change the material for this back. So I'm going to remove, scroll all the way up, our volume and add back in a principled BSDF and set it back to a darker grey. And look at that. I wasn't paying attention. I changed the subsurface color. That won't matter because we've not got any subsurface, but that's something to bear in mind. There we go. We've got a darker color. I'm going to make it slightly sandy this time. Excellent. Let's render that out, and we're back down to less than a second per frame. Brilliant. Okay, let's have a look at these final settings that are here. We've got performance, high quality normals. Hair, we don't have any in our scene. Shadows is something that is important. The cube size and cascade size are for different types of light. If we hover over, we see that cube size specifically deals with point and area lights, and cascade size deals with directional shadows, so a sun lamp. The higher you set these, let's set we don't have a sun lamp, so that won't really apply, but if we set both of these to the highest possible, we're going to get some high quality shadows. And if we zoom in on an area, perhaps I'll be able to focus and get an idea of what these actually mean. So let's set this down to 64 and 64 and change soft shadows and turn it off and render that out. Let's see what effect we get. Okay, so it looks a bit spotty in places. Here we go, there's an issue going on here. We've got spotlights on this scene, so it's perhaps not the best place to demonstrate it. But now if we go to the last slot and increase this back to its default value of 512. Oh, look at that, that's brilliant. We actually can see an effect of a shadow going on there, and I can't remember what this one was, 1024, and render that out. There we go, we're starting to get some jagged edges. Those jagged edges will get smoother and smoother the higher these settings are. There we go. I don't know if you saw that. I was looking at the fields down there. We've got much sharper shadows now. Comes at a cost. We're over a second now. But we've got quite harsh shadows, and that's where soft shadows helps blur the shadows ever so slightly and gives them a more realistic feel. We can also turn up high bit depth, etc. to really make the shadows higher quality. Whether or not you actually see a difference, I don't think you would in day-to-day use. We're going to skip over quite a bit of these extra settings for the moment because there's nothing in our scene that will actually use them. And I want to go right down to the bottom where it says color management. This is somewhat overlooked. Under the look tab, we can actually change how a scene's contrast is affected, and it will actually affect the renderings as well. So if we go down to color management whilst looking in the rendering tab, we can see here that if we change the look, so very low contrast, it will flatten the image. There won't be a huge difference between light and dark areas. However, if we go to very high contrast, it looks dramatically different. And this might be a style that you want to go for. And it's very easy to change these settings and get an image that you prefer than the default one that would be coming out. And when you change this, it changes it everywhere. So we can see it in the viewport as well. So it's not something that you have to only look at the rendering tab for. It's everywhere where you've got an image. You can see it in both the 3D viewport whilst you're in rendered mode and in the rendering tab itself. Okay, there's a lot to take in there when it comes to Eevee. One of the primary takeaways that I want you to have is that it fakes it. And because it fakes it, it is able to render things really quickly. However, that will come with a couple of drawbacks. And later on, we'll discuss how you can use a bit of knowledge of how these render engines actually work to choose the right render engine for the scene that you're creating. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. Render out your Eevee scenes, show me what you've got, and then in the next lecture we'll deal with cycles. See you then.